I always tell people 99% of people who see your buildings like will never go inside. And so there's a really important aspect of how you face the street. What are you giving the public? And then if you really want to control the guest experience, in this case, if it's a hotel, there's got to be some thought into how you connect the interior and the exterior. And sometimes it is deliberate that they're not connected. You want to affect that experience and really shock people. You can make the interior really weird and really different than the outside. And that could be on purpose. And either way, like if it's intentional that they match or intentional that they don't, I think that has an impact. It's when it's not intentional that it can be really bad.
I was trying to figure out where would be a fun place to start. And like, I usually go through life story, your background. I think we'll get there. But one thing that I've appreciated about you and some of the projects that I've seen you work on our friendship online have been really pretty. And I wanted to kind of talk about taste and understand from your experience working on historic buildings in New York City, how you develop taste. Because believe it or not, some architects don't have taste. And I'm sure you've seen all the above. So I'd love to kind of learn more about how your taste was refined and what you think about taste.
Oh, it's super interesting. I've actually never had anyone ask me, at least not on a podcast. I mean, I think taste is just it's almost like a mix of your experiences, and I think that you're able to refine that and kind of really figure out the things that you like the more exposed you are to stuff. So obviously travel if you have the opportunity to do it, but now with all the resources that we have, I think there's no reason to not be constantly looking at design and constantly looking at different things that might call your attention and that feel good. I think I was talking to a friend of mine who's an architect recently about how there's so much design stuff that we look at that is so kind of high design in a way where it almost feels like artwork, and it's not something that you're meant, it's chairs you're not meant to sit on and like tables that are not meant to hold your sweaty drink. And I find that there's a time and a place for that kind of stuff. Like a gallery is great for that. A showroom is awesome, but not in someone's home, not in someone's space. And so, I mean, I think it's really a mix of being really honest about the things that feel good. Especially if you're talking about personal taste and the things that you're putting around your house. So that I think that maybe a little more leeway than a lot of the, academic architects would put into the idea of taste. But I think also just being exposed to a lot. I think, I had a very, I was born in Colombia, and then I lived in Miami. And then I went to school in Boston, and then I lived in New York, and and now I'm living in the Mountain West, splitting time. But I think all of these things and all these travels and nature around you and how you address the landscape with your spaces, all of these things are going to inform your taste. For me, I look at a lot of Latin American architecture, not only because I was born in Colombia, but also because I grew up in Miami. And so there's some of that influence. And then we have sort of the more Florida references of like Sarasota School and mid-century modern, sort of specifically for the tropical modern. And I think I draw on a lot of that for the work that I've done since, not just in design, but also in the way that we solve for our clients and that we solve for our development projects. I think it's really hard to say where exactly each bit of influence comes from, because it all just lives in your head, right? And then it kind of just comes out whenever it needs to come out. But I think if anyone is really interested in like really developing taste and sort of saying like, how do you find those things that feel good and that make sense, not just from like a beauty standpoint, from aesthetic standpoint, but from like a use standpoint. I think like we're just being exposed, right? Going to the museums, understanding the history of some home furnishings, is like looking at, we have so much stuff online now, like, like even really good stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
How much does the exterior of the building limit maybe what you can do with the interior of a building from a design standpoint. One thing that comes to mind, and we'll talk about it, you've spent a lot of time in hotels, but there's been this trend lately where I'm going to pick on REITs because they're easy to pick on. They have like a Marriott, and it's just like a generic box Marriott somewhere. And everyone's talking about lifestyle hotels. So they want to make it a lifestyle hotel, and they have a lot of weight with the brands. They can go do that. And then they just slap, their kid's name on the outside of the building, and they renovate the inside. But on the outside, it still looks like this weird roadside hotel. And on the inside, maybe it's kind of more design oriented. What do you think about the exterior of the building limiting what you can do with the vision inside the building?
I don't think it has to be related. It should be, because again, you're kind of controlling this experience, right? Like there's sort of some expectation. There's some sort of how do you feel when you're approaching the building? How do you feel when you enter? How do you feel when you're in the lobby? And then how do you feel when you're in the room? And sometimes there's a huge disconnect between the lobby and the room, and especially if you're like in the middle of renovation or something like that. So I think that the possibilities are kind of endless. Like it doesn't have to be. Um, but again, I think it goes back to like who do you want to be, and what kind of what are you presenting yourself to be? I always tell people 99% of people who see your buildings like will never go inside. And so there's a really important aspect of how you face the street. What are you giving the public? And then if you really want to control the guest experience, in this case, if it's a hotel, um, there's got to be some thought into how you connect the interior and the exterior. And sometimes, you know, it is deliberate that they're not connected, right? You want to affect that experience and really shock people. You can make the interior really weird and really different than the outside. And that could be on purpose. And either way, like if it's intentional that they match or intentional that they don't, I think that has an impact. It's when it's not intentional that it can be really bad. So I think it really goes back to like who do you want to be, and like how do you want to tailor the experience of the people who visit. Not a lot of people do that. Kind of like what you were saying, right? Like some people will just like uh, change the interior finishes and kind of have this crappy looking box, and then they're like, yeah, it is what it is. And then you kind of walk in and you're like, this feels disjointed and weird, and it's because people didn't think about it. So I think that's what you sense more in the intentionality of matching it or not matching it. And I think it should be on purpose, or hopefully on purpose. um so that's kind of my, it shouldn't limit you, but you should think about it.
Let's talk about kind of your early days in New York. How did you get started in design and architecture, and how did that eventually lead into being on the development side?
Yeah, my first job in New York was for this. Now it's a bigger firm, but it was sort of medium sized when I started working there. It's called Buyer Blenderbell. They do a lot of they have a wide breadth of work that they do. I mean, they have from planning all the way to interior design within the firm. And in the middle there's obviously historic preservation, and they do a lot of institutional work like with the Met and the Empire State Building and so major New York landmarks. But then they also have ground up development work that they do. And so I think that's just really indicative of a very complete firm in New York, because New York and the New York grid was designed in a way where you would have a lot of these experiences mixed in. And the idea was that the city would grow the way that it has, which is kind of awesome. That's a whole conversation I could go into. But working at a firm that really responded to all the things that you would see in New York was actually really great, because I got to work on a wide breadth of stuff. Like we did major rezoning projects, where we had a big impact on the fabric of the city, which is very unusual for New York. We also did a lot of, again, landmarked and major, very well known buildings, like renovations, and how do you improve the lighting in Grand Central, for example. That was a big part of what they did, and I was fortunate enough to work on some of those things. And then I also got to work on new construction and development, and I think that that's where I always wanted to be a developer. I think my parents were developers when I was very young, and so I kind of always had that in my mind, and I always for some reason, there was always the thought that if you wanna be a developer I always had this in my mind. I mean, I know it makes no sense now, but if you wanna be a developer, you should know how to build buildings, and so the only way to you go to school to build buildings is architecture. Um, and so, with that in mind, once I started working in New York and I got to work on those development projects, it sort of was like, "Oh, yeah, this is what I wanna do. I wanna be on the other side of the table, and I wanna be making the decisions, and I wanna understand how this all comes together, and I wanna be on site, and I wanna understand more than just the design, but, like, everything else that happens around it before and after." So I think that that's where it really, kind of hit me that that was definitely what I wanted to do, and that was my path. So and I mean, it's not a very traditional path to get into it, but I think it's been really helpful, especially with the kind of work that I've had the chance to do. It's drawn a lot on my architectural experience for sure.
On the adaptive reuse stuff, what did you learn that you still carry with you today on your current projects?
I think it really tests your like you become adaptive. You become much more adaptable. You have to be. And I think you're going to run into a lot of unexpected situations. And they're going to affect your schedule and they're going to affect all kinds of things, and I think that that's really where if you learn that in that venue, it's so much easier to bring it into everything else in development, right? Like any kind of project is going to require adaptability. It's going to require an agile team. We use it a lot, especially in hospitality, where we have like, we're managing logistics all the time. Um, we have a high volume of work. We're managing procurement, where if one thing is delayed, you got to think on your feet very quickly. Like, how are we going to make up for this so that we're not late? So I think that's the biggest lesson. And if you can deal with existing conditions, I think you could do almost anything.
I want to talk a little bit about your work transitioning into the ownership side and how you made the leap. You obviously wanted to do this forever, but it's still hard to make the leap. So, how did you do it?
Well, and I heard that a lot because when I was in architecture and I was like, this is the change that I want to make in New York, everyone's like, this is super hard. Everyone's like, and for a developer to hire you with no development experience, that's a big deal. Like that not a lot of people do that. And so it was very clear that it was gonna be hard. I mean, it was just so I just basically told a handful of people that I really trusted and that I knew had some really great connections within the development community in the city. And I just went after it until someone did hire me because they were looking for someone kind of with my profile who understood architectural drawing and who could sketch up details and answer questions in the field and stuff like that. So it lined up that that's what they were looking for, but it was, I mean, everyone told me like you're it was funny because I was also working with a recruiter, and he was basically I had two interviews at two big shops. One of them came back, their feedback was you don't have enough design experience, and the other one came back and said you don't have enough construction experience. And I was like, it's funny because when I was talking to the guy and he was giving me the feedback, it was the same day, like literally back to back. He's like, I don't know what to tell you. He's like, this is the funniest thing that I have to say. He's like, it's, these people don't see any way to hire you because of these reasons. And he's like, this makes no sense to me. And I'm like, so yeah, I just went for it. I don't know that there was any direct path or specific way. Like it just a lot of people sometimes go from architecture into like construction management and then they go on to the construction side for a developer. I just went straight into working for a developer. And so that that was how I got into it.
What do most architects not understand or not appreciate about the developer owner world? And then likewise, what do most developer owners not fully appreciate from the architecture side?
That's interesting. I think and having said that, I think there are some extremely developer friendly architects, and likewise, there are some developers who really understand what architects do. So this is by no means, and if you get a team that has like very understanding and um like people with experience, really, that's what it comes down to, then the projects are great. Where you see it become an issue is when sometimes developers don't understand the level of research that a lot of the architects need to do. There are some things where like code specific stuff or solving specific design challenges, like some of these things, like actually doing the drawing takes 20 minutes, but doing all the research that you need to do in order to do the drawing, that'll take you like 3 weeks. And I'm exaggerating to illustrate the point, but there's a little bit of that where sometimes, developers don't understand like how long some of these things take. And so they're like, well, why am I paying this architect for all this money? Like if they're only spending 20 minutes drawing these lines, and it's like, well, you know, so that's one thing. And then the other thing, the other side of the equation where architects that don't get it, and I run into this more with other consultants, like especially niche consultants, not so much with architects, because I think they're getting to see a bit more of feasibility and understanding that certain costs, and I think architects, and especially the really, really good ones, have a really clear understanding of how to de-risk. And so you kind of begin flagging all the things that are like, hey, this could be a problem, this could be an issue, this could be, you might not be able to build as much, you might not be able to afford this material that you really want to use. Sometimes with the architects or consultants, I think they don't understand that there are other forces beyond just like the developer's vision, right? Like there are lenders, um, there are investors. Sometimes a lot of investor relationships are super intertwined. The more projects I work on, especially on our development management company, the weirder and weirder investor structures I see. Sometimes it's family, sometimes it's, investors who are also consultants on the project, um, investors who are part owners of the contractor that you're supposed to use. And sometimes when the design team doesn't understand those relationships, it can be really frustrating and really confusing, because it's like, well, why are you making this really stupid choice? And it's like, well, there's like these other 10 things that I'm considering that I can't talk to you about. I can't talk to anyone about. Um, so I think that that's where I think both on both sides, it comes down to like empathy, right? Because that's just like very common human thing where assume that the person making the decisions and you know, doing the work has considerations beyond what you understand. Um, and sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes people just make stupid decisions. That's 100% true. But I always lead with an assumption that there might be a good reason why they did what they did, or whether they're choosing to work with a certain contractor or not. So I
A
would say
lot of
that
people ask me for
that's fair.
advice and, maybe they're starting out and they want to build like a boutique hotel. And I've gotten the question multiple times where, they can't totally afford the architect or they can't totally afford the designer. So they're like, well, maybe should I pay them this fee and then kind of cut them into the deal somehow? Talk about
No,
that.
no, absolutely not. Just
Why?
it's a bad deal for everyone. So like I'll start out with, if you cannot afford design fees, like you can't afford the project. To period. That's like the first issue with that. The second issue with that is if you're a consultant and let's say you have staff, because some of these drawings are very labor intensive. So you're going to have some people on your team and you need to pay for them. But now you're not taking a fee, but rather you're an investor. Never mind that now your role is super weird and very fuzzy. And not, are you making decisions? Like, that gets really strange. But now you don't have cash coming in to pay your employees. So if you have money just sitting around where you can make your own payroll without needing fees to come in, I would suggest just take that money and put it into an investment. as an investor. And then you don't have to be the designer and the investor because it just gets so bizarre. I think it's such a bad setup for everyone. Unless it's like your own thing. And even then, I tell architects who go into their own development, unless you have a very clear understanding and reason why you're going to be drawing, you shouldn't be drawing. Like it just doesn't, it's not a great, and mind you, I drew and I GC'd my own house, but that, I had a good reason for that.
Well, that's your
Um,
house. That's not a business. That's not an
Also true.
investment,
And I
right?
wasn't taking investor money as well. So
Yep.
that makes a big difference for sure.
You started to work for a firm that did a lot of office to residential conversions. Obviously, I like to call them oil tankers, but they're these old office buildings. There's a lot of old hotels too that I think are going to be obsolete. What do people need to think about that they're not thinking about?
A lot of times, I mean, everyone thinks it's, well, and I think it's died down a little bit, but I want to say maybe like a year and a half ago, everyone was like, office to residential conversions are the sexiest thing ever. Um, and then people would reach out to me because they, either through my network or through social media, just from things I posted. And they were like, there's this office building. It's in a terrible neighborhood. It's awful, awful. No one wants to live. No one wants to go there. No one wants anything to do with that place. I think it would be a great residential conversion. And I'm like, no one wants to go there. Like, how are you selling this thing? And so I think to me, that's indicative that people were thinking of the strategy as the business plan. And that's like not at all how it should be, right? Your business plan is, this is the population increase, or this is the rental increase in this area, or this is the reason why this should be a residential building. Like, you need to start with the way that you would start any deal, right? Like, why here? Why now? Like, there should be a thesis as to why are you doing this. If it turns out that you're converting from something to something else and that helps your business plan, then conversions are great. Usually, and when we see them is in New York specifically, it's for buildings that are overbuilt. So buildings that you could not build today. And there's obviously like a built-in value to that, right? Like, you cannot get 500,000 square feet on that site anymore. But the code allows you to convert the full 500,000 square feet into residential. That's a real value. If there is no reason to do it, I mean, sometimes I'll even get buildings in New York where people are like, we should convert this into residential. And I'm like, why would you? Why not just tear it down? Like, you can use the same amount of square footage. You have 100,000 square foot of a shitty office building. Why would I convert that into residential if I just tear it down and build 100,000 square feet of residential? Like, that makes to me, that's just, it makes no sense. And I think that that's the part where you still need to have a business plan and you need to begin there. And then the strategy can follow. And maybe the strategy is converting, but I would say the bar is much higher than people would like to think on that, on conversions and their feasibility.
How did it work at the firm that you worked at? This is, I think, your first job
My first
on the
development
developer
job,
side? Yeah.
yeah. It worked. I mean, they targeted very specifically buildings that fit within that code um allowance where you could so it was pre 1961. That code has since then updated. It was updated in December of 24. So but before that, the code said basically, if you have a building that's pre 1961 and it's overbuilt and it's within these certain areas of New York, which is basically most of Manhattan, you can then completely convert all of that area into residential. A lot of that was basically put in place in order to respond to the change in a lot of neighborhoods, like the financial district, which was where a lot of where this developer focuses. So it was, the code was put in place to essentially allow the financial district to grow from being financial services into a more residential neighborhood. It provided an advantage to anybody willing to do it. And so they understood that very clearly, and that was their business plan, core business plan. And now he started expanding. I think recently he's bought, or he's been part of deals that are outside of financial district. But I would say for the first I'm say maybe 20 years or so, he stuck to that original business plan. So that's how. And also too, the other thing that they did is very smart. They're an owner GC, so they hold all contracts directly. That's very unusual in New York. Um, and that obviously allows you for some savings or some better structuring that ultimately gives you better pricing. So it was a mix of those two things. I would say those are the bigger strategies. Well, and also too, they self manage, so they have their own management companies. So then it's all rentals, and then they manage the rentals. So I think the cash flow and also too, like the big picture of the strategy allowed them to kind of build this company around that. So that's how they really did it.
How did they overcome the strategies or the challenges with like big floor plates, I don't know, windows and plumbing? Like, how did they make it work? Because a lot of people, I think, are struggling to make the actual building work.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's a mix of um number one, the owner, he was very involved in the layouts. And I think he understood very well, especially because they had their management company, understood very well what rented and what didn't. I think a big part of the thesis too was the fact that they're in New York and there is demand for this, right? If you go into a market that doesn't have windowless bedrooms, guess what? Like, no one's going to want your building because they have 10 other options that are better. Whereas in New York, like there is demand to live in certain places, there is demand to have a certain amount of space. And so you kind of overcome it by providing the things that people are looking for, where the the setbacks, if you will, are not real setbacks. They're not unsurmountable because you're actually providing all this other stuff that people actually want. So, and I think that again, that goes back to like, business plan. If you're doing something in a place where there is demand for it, then you respond to the demand. If you're trying to do this office building conversion in the middle of nowhere where no one wants to go, guess what? Like it's not going to be successful. So that is again like they're very aware of the market.
What was the most common challenge you had to overcome with that developer? So let's say the business plan worked, you're in the financial district. What were the typical things there's like, well, if we're going to do this deal, we have to see if this works?
I mean, I think that I don't know specifically. I mean, floor plates was definitely one of them, for sure. I think also, and this has changed since, but I think for a while, like a lot of people didn't really necessarily want to live in the financial district. Um, so I think for them, it was just more a matter of sticking to it, and then sort of growing as the neighborhood, the residential aspect of the financial district grew, and then they just kept doing the same thing over and over again. Um, I think for them, I mean, I don't know now how they're underwriting and looking at deals. I think there's, some questions as to whether some of these bigger and more ambitious projects are feasible in general. I don't think that's just a question for them. It's a question for anybody taking it on. Um, but I think, yeah, once you're like in it, let's say market is great and everything, I would say floor plates is sort of the next thing to look at. Like once you start actually saying, okay, this works, but now what? How do we create this thing? And how much efficiency can you get? Because you do lose a lot of square footage in the center of buildings just because it's a conversion. Whereas when you're doing a building from scratch, like you could be much more efficient, much tighter with circulation, wasted space, that kind of stuff. So I think that if they were able to get the efficiency, which they could, because again, they knew the market really well and they knew how to lay out well enough. I think the magical number in my mind, and I'm not sure if I learned that directly from working there or this was just more something we all kind of knew. But 20,000 square feet is kind of where stuff gets really weird. Beyond the 20,000 square foot floor plate, it starts to get bizarre. Like
Do you have to make donuts a lot?
we made a donut in one of the buildings at 180 Water, and the cool thing was like you made the whole, which is 30 floors. And then the remaining area we put back on top of the building for like the amenities in the gym. So like and that's part of the rule that the zoning allows you to do is like you have this much area because that's how much area exists. If you carve it out, then you can go back and put it somewhere else. So long as you continue meeting all the other zoning, as long as you don't make your nonconformances worse. And so, if let's say there is no height restriction, but let's say there is like a sky exposure or maybe like a tower control requirement, as long as you're able to meet that with this extra area, you could put it back into on top of the building. And so that is what and I came into that project later. That one had already been started when I started working with them. But yeah, like that's not super common. Those are not easy to do. And they're expensive.
What was the biggest thing and most important thing you learned with that developer?
Again, I honestly I think the agility, adaptability in terms of your schedules and how you sequence things, but also from like a team perspective, um, and managing and dealing with people. I think that those were sort of the biggest lessons, and then more like on the entrepreneurial lessons for me were more about how I do and how I don't want to run my team, um, what I do and what I don't want to do with my company. And I think that was sort of the beginning of me really thinking about, if you disagree so much with how someone runs the place, or if you don't like how people typically um, run an office, go start your own thing, right? Like you don't like it, go do it yourself. And I think that was kind of for me the beginning um of that thought of like maybe the answer here is going to be doing my own thing. So that was kind of the bigger, different in terms of it's not a management lesson. It's just more like a professional career lesson.
So how did you want to run your company?
I mean, we run things very differently. I would say than a lot of places too, and that's just not only in the way that like we treat people and that we are with our teams and our outside teams too, because that's really important, right? Like you're at any given moment. I think our typical team size, I would say, is at least 30, including external consultants. So yeah, and then we have some massive teams. Like we're working on a big project right now in Florida where, you know, most meetings are 15 people and up. And that's not the whole team, right? Like that team is probably going to be, I would say, all said and done, it's probably going to be 80 to 100 people. Oh, yeah. So, and that's because we have very specialized and specific things that we're doing. But really considering kind of like I guess having empathy and being and listening to people and being kind. And I think that not enough people put that forward. And some people might say, "Oh, well, that's not really how you manage." And it's like, no, yeah, it is because that is the way that we get people to do for us. Like you're going to spend 3 to 5 or 3 to 7 years working on a project. People are going to make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes. People are going to have to ask for favors. How willing are people going to like, how willing is everyone going to be to row in the same direction for an extended period of time under some stressful circumstances? And so, and I think that we've seen it. We've seen it on projects already where treating people kindly, listening to people, being and being on it too. I'm not. This isn't like being weak or not negotiating, or it's none of that. It's actually, it allows you to be much tougher in negotiation. It buys you goodwill when you're super tough in negotiating, but then they know that you're going to be fair through the process. It just, it creates better management at the end of the day. I think it creates better projects. It creates a better environment. We've had people tell us like after we're wrapping up a project, they'll say, like, I kind of hate my life, except this project is actually pretty great. Um, I think the idea of someone showing up to work, and I think of this people that I hire, like I feel a real responsibility. Like these people are kind of betting their livelihood on me and on what we do and on my ability to bring in work, my ability to do deals, to find investors. I owe them not making them miserable every time that we chat. Like that's just to me that's basic human decency, and I think that that's just different. because I lead with that. I'm not saying that people aren't kind or that there's no room for it, but I don't know that a lot of places lead with, we're going to make this a good environment. We're going to make this a good group of people to work with. So I think that's one thing that we do differently. And then the way we structure our work and the way that we approach the work is also very different. We're a little bit unusual because we do have a very, in terms of development management, because we have a very strong consulting design background, which most development managers or owners reps, they tend to be on construction heavy, whereas we're, I would say, very well balanced. We are also super strong on the construction side, but it's not the only thing that we do. So that makes us a better rounded development manager. We do everything. We really do. Like, you could give me the keys and I'll give you the keys when the building's done. And, you know, it should be fairly straightforward. Um, Also the way we set our fees, we don't take kickbacks. We don't do markup on cost. We just do flat fee based on scope. And that, I think initially when I said it, I said this is probably the most straightforward way to do this. But as time has gone on, all of these things that we believe about kindness and goodwill and making it a good environment, it all really plays into the way that we structure our contracts, actually. Because there is no opacity in us taking kickbacks or doing markups. It is very upfront. It's like, this is it. It's fair. It's honest. And these are the reasons why we show our work. And I think that kind of all really comes together and works really well. And I think in that sense, from like a fee perspective and the structure perspective, we're also a little bit different.
How long did it take you to figure all this out? Did you figure it out at this original firm and then you worked for other people and did it? Or did you kind of learn it along the way and want to do things differently than how a lot of people were doing it?
I mean, I think it's one of those where you get that initial feeling that, like, there's got to be a better way to do this. And maybe sometimes you don't know exactly what that is exactly, right? Like, you don't know the every detail of, well, I'm going to put this in my contract because this means this or that. I think it was just more because we had also managed owners reps. We had managed outside development managers. And I knew all the sort of pressure points of that, a percentage on cost. Some of these people were definitely taking kickbacks to put certain people in certain positions or hire certain contractors, buy certain materials. Um, just being aware of kind of all these pitfalls. And I'm not saying like we're absolutely perfect, but I do feel like the way that I've done it has been more and more intentional as we've gone on. I think when I started out, like I said, it just felt more straightforward from like a contractual standpoint. Because I spent so much time negotiating agreements with people that I'm like, contractually, this is just much more straightforward. And I remember thinking at the time, if this doesn't work, we could always change. We could always go to hourly. We could always do a percentage on cost if that makes more sense in the future. But then we got to make sure that we find a way to keep the transparency that I like to keep. And so it was more like it got cemented with time. It wasn't like, it was more like these things feel good. And I think that when things feel good, again, like we were talking about developing taste, like it's something that just, it aggregates over time. Like, I don't think that there was like a specific um strategy off the bat that you're like, this is the perfect strategy that entirely encapsulates who we are. It's like, I don't know that any company has that when you start, especially. Um, you kind of try what feels good, and if it really works, and you're like, yeah, this is who we are, then you keep doing it, and you have more data to back up like why you made that decision. But sometimes that's not clear until later on.
Real estate's a relationship business. And one of the things I learned, particularly on the construction side, and maybe you'll think I'm crazy, maybe you won't, but particularly for new construction, I think there's a lot less value in trying to bid out GCs and have multiple GCs bid out your project, as opposed to picking someone who you think is strong, fair, honest from the beginning and let them run through the design phase and bid out the project ongoing. And it's been my personal experience that most GCs will land in a similar place on the budget at the beginning, but they'll land in very different places at the end. And it's sometimes there's little value in running a big process where they're all bidding to probably most of the same subs at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think it. It depends on the market and it depends on your relationships because sometimes if you have identified somebody and they're going to be great, we've done that before. Usually because there were existing relationships with the project owner. And so the way that we handle that typically is um, we're very straightforward from the beginning. We say, hey, look, you're going to do pre-con. We're going to pay you for it. This is how we're going to work. You're going to take us through design. We're going to do all this together, but we're going to bid it out. So the job is yours to lose. But we say that on day one. Like there's no surprise. Like you worked really hard for 2 years and all of a sudden now it's going to go to the next bidder. So what that does, again, it keeps that transparency and it sort of builds that trust because from day one, you're like, hey, look, like it's going to be yours to lose. In some markets, it's interesting because even though people bid to the same subs, the subs will price it differently to different GCs. And I think that's something that sometimes people don't realize. It's like sometimes, yeah, you are kind of negotiating on the GC's fee and general conditions and how efficient they are at running the job. Sometimes that is exactly what you're having them compete on. But sometimes it's their relationships too. And I think that is harder to know sometimes unless you bid it. And because I've had markets where we will go out and I will see the same sub across every GC's bid, and then their number is not the same. So we've seen it multiple times where some subs just don't like working with some GCs, and that's data, right? Like that's information to me because that means that if something happens, there's an issue or whatever, one of these GCs is going to be able to get this guy to do stuff for them, and the other ones won't, or at least not as easily. So I think that it's so. I don't know that there are hard, fast rules about it. I do encourage people, especially people who have like a guy, they always use the same guy. After like 10, 15 years, like if they have never bid him out, they should bid him out. Like, like, so you gotta, I think there's some nuance to it, but there is some value to what you're saying. Um, I just think it also varies from market to market. Like there are some markets like New York, for example, where everyone is expecting to get bid out. Everybody. There's no expectation that you're the only guy forever. Like this is, and you have such a good sub pool that you can get no repeat subs for all your bids. And then now you're like actually competing like team versus team, right? Like this GC with these subs and versus this GC with those other subs. So it's market specific. There are some markets where like we literally cannot get there aren't 3 electricians who can do the job. There's literally one guy. So like you're gonna get the guy. Period. It's just who has the best relationship with him.
Other than price, when you're talking to subs or GC, what's most important?
I mean, it's actually never price, which is really interesting. Um, we want to make sure that you have the full scope because I think that's the thing that people get wrong a lot of the time. They'll focus on price, they don't focus on scope, and they buy the wrong thing.
How do you make sure they have the right scope?
Oh, we sit in every buyout meeting. We're there, we're in the room. Especially for major trades. We basically make sure that we're there. Um, I mean, we make sure that there's a competitive bid process too. So where you're having more than one bid, and generally that tends to give you a very good market understanding for that specific trade. Sometimes, again, like it depends on the market, but I would say most of the time, if you have 3 to 5 bids, like you're gonna know very quickly if you're within market or not. And if somebody really screwed up that scope, it's gonna be super clear.
So how do you know, like oftentimes people will say like, oh, these are 80% CDs or 85% CDs or 90% CDs. How do you know if they're 90% or 99%? Because nothing's ever 100%. Like, what is there like a special checker or something you can do to be like, find all these change orders that are going to come down the road? Or are these really complete?
No, I mean, I think it can get really ridiculous with the percentages. I agree. Like that's not for me. It's just more like how coordinated are you, and then how detailed are you? How coordinated are you determines whether you're in design development, and then how detailed are you means how complete you are in construction documents. There are some instances where like a single line in a drawing can cost you a few $100,000 because it was like you were missing flashing, and now it's all you have a very specific rain screen and it has to be a metal that likes the metal that you're using for the rain screen. And now this thing is a bunch of money that you weren't expecting. So, it's tough to say, like, was that 90? Was that 99? Like, what, if you miss the one line, but it's only one line in a 300-page set of drawings. So I think it's just more a matter of really understanding your major trades, understanding how complete they are, and then understanding where the holes are. Because sometimes there are holes. Sometimes it's related to material availability. Sometimes it's related to maybe you're waiting for comments from the building department. Sometimes you're waiting for the owner to make a decision. And so it's kind of like, how do you create your list of allowances, and how complete is that? So I think that that's kind of the other part where um, it's not a conversation that you can have in a vacuum as your drawings are 90% complete. It's like, how much do you understand what's in your drawings? And how much do you understand that that is what's being priced versus certain assumptions that you could possibly make that will make your bids more complete? Maybe your drawings are only to 90%, but if your bidders are really, really good and they know that, oh, if you're drawing this line, you're going to need this other material. It might not say it in your drawings just yet, but you're going to need it because we have experience and we know, the quality of your bidders is also going to have a huge impact on what that 90% means.
I want to talk a little bit about hotels, but before we get there, this kind of question popped into my mind as you were saying all that. On your development management business, if I was to get a reference from one of your clients, what would they, not what do you want them to say, but like how would they kind of simply describe you and your company? Like, what are you known for?
I don't, well, we're known for picking up broken projects and putting them back together. And that's kind of one of the things that we've come in midway into a lot more projects than I would like. Because number one, ideally, we're involved from the beginning, but sometimes that doesn't happen. And ideally, people aren't getting fired midway from a project. So from those both perspectives, I think that that's sort of what I don't. It's interesting because I do give give client references. Like my clients do have provided references multiple times. We've gotten projects because of prior client references, so they must be saying good stuff. But also super important to me is we give references of contractors we've worked with and lawyers we've worked with and architects and like major trade subcontractors that we've worked with. Because to me, it's not just about being like a yes man to the owner. You can have owners that could give a great reference because you were super easy to work with or you were cheap or whatever. But behind the scenes, if everyone absolutely hated working with you and the project was a nightmare, except you were like a yes man and the client liked you because you were charismatic, it might have cost the owner 30% more and they're none the wiser. But everybody else on the team, they'll know. So I think for me, it's super important that we don't only give client references, we also give references of our peers, essentially, within the projects. Because I think they're the pros, right? They're the people who are really have frame reference to say, okay, you guys were good or you guys were actually really hard to work with. And because of that, we charge your client, 20% more in our contract, which happens, by the way.
I'm sure. So let's talk about hotels, the hardest real estate asset class ever created, I think. How did you get into hotels?
So after when I was working in development, in the city, uh, it, the TWA project had started already. And I think
For
the guy
those that
who,
don't know, like, give us the background on that whole thing.
so the TWA hotel is basically a repositioning of what used to be the TWA airline terminal building at JFK Airport. And then there's a ton more to the story. The story is actually kind of long, so I won't go into that. But the terminal building itself was turned into the lobby of the hotel, and then two new towers were built sort of behind it. to actually accommodate the actual guest rooms. The terminal itself is only about 100,000 square feet, so it's not. It wouldn't, and it's a very unusual building. If you're not familiar with it's sort of wild. It's crazy that that thing was built in 1958, and it was the youngest landmarked building ever. It was only 40 years old when it was landmarked in 1993, or about 40 years old, which is unusual because the landmark guideline is 50 years. But this building was in a precarious situation in the sense that like the Panam terminal had been recently demolished. And so TWA was kind of next, and people were sort of did all kinds of things to save it. And it was saved, and now it's really not going anywhere because now it's part of this new project. So that that RFP took forever. Someone else was going to develop the project. That didn't work out. And so it ended up eventually someone was able to move it forward. And they had started that project, I would say maybe like a year, 18 months before I got involved in terms of construction. The whole process had been going on for, I would say, maybe 10 years prior. Because it was super complicated. You're at the airport, you're on Port Authority land. It's a lease. You're leasing the land from the Port Authority. You don't really own the building. You got to go through the Port Authority for all approvals. It's complex. So, and not only that, but now you had a landmark. So you had the National Park Service involved. Like you had historic preservation, like the Landmarks Committee from New York involved. You had the building department from New York involved.
Sounds painful.
We had like 23 government agencies we had to deal with, basically. When most people had like 3 or 4. And that's a pain. We had 23. So, it was just, we had all kinds of things to meet. That project had started, and the guy who ended up hiring me, who was my boss, not the owner of the company, but kind of like the head of construction, he was looking for help. I mean, this project was massive. And also, too, the company owned a bunch of hotels across the country. That was kind of it is their core business to this day. They are a REIT. And so they also needed help with all of the renovations that were going to be coming up. Because, again, they own a bunch of select service, and you have some requirements there in terms of like how often you renovate. And I think that, it was a mix of those two things coming together, them building a team and kind of looking at development a little bit more for a little while in New York. And then in that context, I was hired, both to help with the national stuff, but also to help with TWA. So that's kind of how I ended up working in hospitality. And it was mostly reigned by the fact that I had all this existing conditions experience from like working for the developer. And then also I had all of the more kind of historic preservation understanding of how to handle historic buildings from my time in architecture. Funny enough, one of the principals at the architecture firm where I used to work at Bayard Bell, he was like instrumental in saving the building, like years before I worked there. But he was basically one of the people who said, no, we can't tear this down. And he kind of moved all the historical people to get around it and save it. So,
is there a story that kind of encapsulates your time on that project, but also some of the nuances of the hotel that you can share?
I think it was more, I guess this encapsulates the idea of hotel and in the how unpredictable the work can be. So we were about 3 weeks out from opening date. And at that point, you're working super long hours. I was on site every day. It was crazy. And then we get like a meeting, and then they're like, okay, well, we're about to open this building. Mind you, there's a ton of like security and like all these things that need to start happening because the governor was going to come to the opening. And so you're starting to kind of gear up and go from full construction opening mode to like operations, really, and operations of like a big event, because your opening is going to be a big event. And all of a sudden it was like, well, we kind of can't work half of next week because we're going to have the Louis Vuitton Resort fashion show in the flight center,
Oh,
which is
wow.
also an active construction site. And I think all of us, I think the Turner was a general contractor, but all the supers, project managers, like we were all like, what is going on? Like, and this fashion show, like you hear it and it's like, it was this massive production, right? Like this decision was made 3 or 4 weeks before we had to open. And the fashion show was going to happen basically 10 days, around 10 days before we opened, or 2 weeks around that time frame. I don't remember exactly. Um, and so now we had to stop work. We had to get ready for all of this crazy production. And then we kind of had to figure out how we were going to do, how we were like now, like there were certain things like I remember I was in the middle of installing a bar, like a bar top, like this onyx bar top that had taken forever. And it took me a lot of favors to get these guys to show up on this day because we had changed schedule around. And now I was going to have to cancel it again. And I remember like they were doing rehearsals and we had all these models lined up on behind the Paris Cafe. And I was doing the Lisbon Lounge bar. And I was like, I didn't cancel the guys. I had to sneak him into the building. I was getting yelled at. And I'm like, I am sorry. I'm like, this is gonna happen. And like, you, there's gonna be some forgiveness here that I'm gonna have to ask for or whatever, but we're gonna install this bar today. And so you had like models lining up and like, you know, it was just super surreal. And I think that that's just hospitality is. Like,
That's it.
that.
So you say you want to be in the
Exactly.
hotel business, listen to this clip, and that's, multiply that by 20, and that's your year. That's under construction. Okay, so on a hotel like this that is a TWA building, it's very themed. How do you make it not Disney World, but still make it on brand, on theme with what you're trying to do? Because a lot of people could have screwed this up, I think, really bad.
I think they leaned heavily on the museum aspect of it, right? Like there was a lot of there's a l- there was a lot of historical component to it from like and just this is one thing that comes to mind easily, but like the flight attendant uniforms, like from that all the way to like the history of the architecture and the history of TWA and Howard Hughes, who was eccentric and had all these crazy ideas. And so when you lean more on the history and you turn it more into a museum and less of like a theme park, I think that helps a little bit, but also own it, right? Like there's an aviation, it's like who's your audience, right? And so there's that aviation component, there's the architecture component, right? Like a lot of architects, friends of mine have said, oh, I went and I stayed there because I had to see it. And and so kind of leaning in and understanding who your audience is going to be and tailoring it for them, I think turned it into a more, it's because for a theme park, theme parks in my mind are more for everyone, right? Like you're catering to everyone, you're kind of going to your lowest denominator sort of thing. Whereas when you're doing something from a museum or a historical perspective, like you're going to have niche things that maybe the general public doesn't understand, but the aviation enthusiast or the architectural enthusiast is going to understand and appreciate. And so I think that partly because there were some historic components that were required as part of the preservation, but part of it was because like it was part of the vision. So I think that made it a little bit more serious in that sense.
In that context, then, how do you create a vibe where people want to be, feel like they can party, have a good time, enjoy the space, and not totally feel like they're in a museum and can't touch anything? What is important when you're like evaluating that, whether it's on this project or another similar type project that you've experienced or seen or visited?
One of the things that we were talking about earlier was like, how do you um how do you control that experience? Right? Because that's what it comes down to, kind of like taste and all that. And I think that intentionality really ends up being the answer again, right? Like if you make a space specifically for, um, for you to sit around a bar and lounge, like where do people sit? Like, is it a four top? Are the tables round? Like, what kind of furniture do you have? Is it more loungy? Is it not? What's the lighting like? Where's the window? Where's the sun coming through? Is that going to be uncomfortable? And I think that that's where people feel that when you're intentional about it. They might not be able to tell you exactly what you did, but they could tell you it feels good or not. And I think that that to me ends up being an indication of intentionality again. And it's in everything that we do. If you do it with purpose, people notice.
When you visit hotels, or maybe it's projects that you've worked on or projects that you've fixed, what do most like early, maybe first time, second time lifestyle hotel entrepreneurs, what mistakes do they make most often in the programming, the design? You take it however you want.
Trying to be like everything to everyone. I think sometimes like people don't necessarily pick a focus, and that again, it precludes you from being intentional. So again, like we go back to a massive principle that we have in the work that we do, especially when we're doing like a lot of design heavy stuff. Like right now, we're working on a big master plan, and we had a big meeting, we had a few moves, and then I was like, guys, like, do you realize that we have this problem now, which is completely against our initial intent? And I think that not going back enough to like, who are we? Who do we want to be? So number one, not defining who you want to be. And then number two, not being intentional in it. I think and that's such a squishy thing to say, but that's where I find people make a lot of mistakes because it leads to just bad decisions. Like you end up hiring the wrong architect, you end up hiring the wrong interior designer, you end up hiring the wrong marketing team even, right? Like don't build a product you're supposed to build. You don't target the audience you're supposed to target. And all of a sudden people wonder why their projects don't work. So that's where I think those I think are the biggest mistakes because they're also kind of unsurmountable. Like once you're kind of down the road of bad decisions and it's not cohesive, there's no like value engineering that. It's just you're surrounded by the wrong people, you're building the wrong thing, and now you just gotta finish the project as best as you can. So I'd say that's the biggest issue I see people make.
How would they correct that from the start? Is it like hiring a better kind of vision storyteller branding person, or do you get the designer in first? Like how do you like kind of put yourself in the best position for success if maybe you kind of know what you like but you're not like the total visionary creative?
I think in that sense, having having wherewithal and having a little bit of like understanding who you are, right? Like understanding the things that you're good at, the things that you're not good at, and saying like, okay, I need a better I need a better commercial person. There are some really great consultants that can help with visioning and branding and that kind of stuff, and they help you position yourself in the market correctly. They help you with brand partnerships that kind of support what you're about. There's some great, and sometimes there are architects who are extremely aware of all these things and can put you in touch with those people as well, or can give you guidance to answer the questions early on. Because what happens a lot of the times is people lose intentionality because they don't answer like the major program questions, right? Like, okay, you're gonna have a gift shop, let's say, but what like is it themed? Does it tie to the city? Like, are you selling art? Are you selling teddy bears? Like, what is it? Does it add to the vibe? Is it also a cafe? Like, and sometimes people are like, well, I don't know. And then you just slap something together and you just kind of have something at the end of the day, and it ends up being super weird because it's very disjointed and it doesn't have intention. So I think kind of understanding from the beginning to say, and kind of losing the ego about it because sometimes people are very like married to ideas or how to execute on ideas when it turns out that they don't know how to execute on it. They might have a fantastic idea and that might be the right path, but they are not the ones to hire the team or to make the big strategic brand partnership decisions.
That's a great statement because, we were working on a project actually with a designer that had a lot of experience in kind of like luxury lifestyle, like 4 or 5 star stuff. and we were doing a kind of 3-star-ish boutique kind of hotel. And the designer's like, "Oh, we're gonna have this really cool like gift shop." And she's showing this gift shop in the mood boards and everything. And I'm like, "Yeah, that's cool, but when you have a hotel, you have to think about how you're gonna operate it. And we don't have like the budget on the operation side to have a full-time buyer and curator for this cutesy little themed gift shop that you're thinking of having." And like they kept showing it and showing it. I kept having to explain, like, listen, I love the idea, but like who is actually going to buy the stuff? Like maybe I'll do it for the first time, or like someone will get someone to do it, but then who's going to do it? Who's going to staff it? Like the people are just going to steal all the stuff. So that's definitely something that I've seen tends to be a disconnect. And one of the things that is unique about the company you used to work for, they own like a mix of really cool boutique and lifestyle hotels and a ton of like 3-star typical cookie cutter branded hotels. So in that environment, how did they figure out to do both things presumably well under one roof? Is it different teams? Is it like the same people? They just can do both? How does that work?
I mean, I'm not sure how they're doing it now. Like, it's been several years since I've worked there. I think at the time when I was there, it was sort of separate teams. Um, I think on the select service, like 3-star side, they had a really great operational structure. And that was really, because at the end of the day, that is what makes select service hotels, right? Is like, how efficiently do you operate them? Um, and so they had just incredible people. I mean, I met some really awesome people while I was working there. Still stay in touch with some of them because they're just great humans. And but they were very good at the job, like very good at the work. And I think that that was the foundation of everything else. I think everything else in the boutique stuffs, I don't know exactly how well it operates. I don't know exactly the details of it in New York. So I can't comment on that. But I think it's something that it was generally different groups of people anyway. Even different ops people who were more full service oriented and had more full service New York experience. I know that there's been some changes in that team, so I'm not entirely sure how they're doing it now. Um, but it does seem like a very weird and difficult mix. I think one of the things too that you said was where we see a lot of sort of missteps from people is they don't engage the operational side. Like they'll have a vision and then they won't necessarily, or and even they have the great brand strategy and great ideas and maybe it's boutique and everything, but if you don't engage ops early on, and that's something that we push on a ton when we, especially when we, particularly when we do boutique work, because if you're not branded and you don't have those specific guidelines that you're following, you might run into some real operational problems. And so we do one of two things. We have a lot of experience with branded hospitality. And so that allows us to say, hey, you're probably going to need a bigger corridor. You're going to need a bigger trash room. You're going to need some laundry. These are pick up and drop off. And so we have that experience. But also we begin pushing very early on to say, well, who's the operator and are they sitting in the room when we're making these decisions, particularly decisions around like FF&E, material selection, the locations and adjacencies of the back of house, that kind of stuff. So, more on the technical side, I think then you get into the weeds and then you need to have the operator. It's more where the unsurmountable massive mistakes people make at the beginning are like strategy and branding for sure. They just hire like you said, you had this very high end designer on like a 3-star hotel. Like they're gonna have some things that they just don't yet understand. And some designers could be great and can do both. But for people who strictly do one kind of thing, it's not the same.
It's not the same. So you've had this dream to become a developer. You started your own company. You're developing other people's projects and helping them. But now you're doing your own stuff. How are you thinking about that? How are you doing it? Let's start there.
Yeah. So, I mean, the idea of starting the development management company was that it would be the platform on which we started a development company. So, from the way that we set up our fees, the setup of the team, the expertise of the team, the time in the market and our relationships. all of those things have been the basis of the beginning of our development company. And so the positioning there has been extremely deliberate. Um, and that began with keeping a very lean team, which we talked a little bit about before the call, but just basically being as efficient and as good. And I know that's kind of a very general thing to say, but we've created a really good reputation and we've had some really great partnerships with our clients. So I think that in lieu of a track record, because technically we don't have one, having enough people that can speak well of our work and executing for an extended period of time with that intention has been a massive part of our position. So that part, assembling the team. So our team, I'm a registered architect in the state of New York. But also my main development guy, he's a professional engineer in the state of New York. He has construction experience. He has been a structural engineer in New York. He has development experience. And he's been working with me for a while now. So there's kind of like team cohesiveness. We're not A lot of developers start and then when they get the first project, they have to hire a team for the first time. And now you got all these people. You're trying to like build a plane while you fly it kind of thing. Um, and there's some aspect to that in development in general that you can't avoid. But our team is basically already built and our team is already paid for because we have our development management clients who pay for the team. So the idea is that we're in a position not only from a foundational aspect where, okay, the team has been working together, we've proven that we're good working together, we've executed for other people, but also we are not doing anything stupid for fees. Like, we're not taking investor money to do stupid stuff because we don't have to, because the team is paid for. So that's the other. And then even our own, just revenue from the management company is enough for, to go into start the fund, which we did. And we can talk a little bit about that. But to begin investing in our own deals. So from several perspectives, the positioning has been super strong and it's been very deliberate. And it's something that I've been thinking about for years. So now it was the time. And I think that once it started feeling like there was a little bit of the end of like the zero interest rate era. Because that was, for me, I didn't think that that was the right time for us to get into it because our main selling point is the execution, right? Like we know how to do the work extremely well. Um, it's difficult to compete with people who have unlimited money because you're not competing on execution, you're competing on something else, which we didn't have. And which we still don't have, right? Like I don't, and that we're seeing less of, right? There isn't unlimited money at the moment. So we're competing on execution, and that's what we're offering investors, not only at the project side, on the project management side, but also on the way that we report to investors and the way that we have structured our fund and the way that we're structuring our deals is really kind of as a service to investors, really. So, and we can do that because the team is paid for. So it's they all kind of work together. So that I spent a ton of time doing that. Once kind of 2024, beginning of 2024, I think it felt like the better time to say, okay, we're going to compete on execution because execution is going to become more and more important as zero interest rates kind of get rid of a lot of people who were just throwing money at stuff rather than executing properly. Um, and at that time, that's when I got together with my partner on the development side. So it's technically a very different company, completely different company, but the team is the same in terms of the management of the work.
How do
Um,
you get comfortable? Like, how did you get comfortable with some of the stuff that maybe you did or maybe you didn't have a lot of involvement in, like I don't know, underwriting or purchasing the property or selling, you're going to do condos. So that whole side of it, how did you gain experience and expertise in that made you feel comfortable to go raise capital and do it?
yeah, I think, and I'll just be like totally honest on that part. I think there's a certain level of discomfort that anybody who starts any new business is always going to feel. And even on the development management side, which we've been doing for a long time, every time we get a new project and there's a new challenge, it feels slightly uncomfortable. And I think that speaks more to kind of our um like I take it very seriously, right? Like we're managing for most people, we're managing the majority of their investment on the project. Now it's in my hands. Like they're trusting me with tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars, and that's not lost on me. Like I take it super serious. And I think that if you ever stop feeling that discomfort, there's something wrong. Like you're either not taking it seriously or so, but having said that, I think we went down the list of all the things that we felt we needed to have at the same level as our project management skills. And so for underwriting and for kind of structuring the financial side of it, managing investors, investor relations, understanding how to put the fund together from like a regulatory standpoint, I did several things. I think the first thing was, and this is experience that translates from my development management. First is hiring the right people. Like we have securities counsel who's exceptional. And it's not just someone who's following the law, but it's someone who can take the time and sit with us and explain to us why we need to comply with certain things, how those things are important, what that means for our investors. In to the extent that we are now able to explain that to people. For me, a lot of it has been learning all of these things and really kind of going into them the same way that we've gone into development management, where, there are certain things about like Lutron systems that I know that I probably shouldn't know. But for some
I think it's
projects,
a good thing to know that. So I
exactly.
don't know. The other stuff, you could chat GPT, you could talk to your lawyer, but some of those things it's hard to figure out other than on the job.
On the job, and then you learn it to the extent that you can explain it. And I don't want to ever be in front of an investor and they ask me a question and then I have to say, "Oh, I don't know the answer to that. Like let me send you to my lawyer." I just never want to be in that position. Obviously, if there's ever a situation where we need to have counsel help explain or be in the room, for sure they're available and they're wonderful. So that was the first thing we kind of really got some great people. We're looking at some projects in New York that have historic components to them. We've engaged um, more than we've engaged basically a really great outside team. So we started talking to architects. Even though I'm a New York registered architect with historical building experience, like I am talking to people who are doing projects today, who have incredible track records and doing beautiful stuff that fits our aesthetic. And so we started talking to them. On the sales side, we actually have done a ton of back and forth with the Corker and Sunshine team. They have 75% of market share in New York. They have a ton of data on what's selling, what kind of condos are people buying, like what kind of stuff do you need to do, what neighborhoods are better than others, like. And so for us, like it's been engaging these people early. They've been part of us crafting the thesis. It's a very serious endeavor. Like we take it really seriously. So all of those things that helped us mitigate for maybe the things that I haven't done a dozen times, but I know how to manage them and get to those people. And now those people are people we've been working with for several months, like some of them more than a year now. And then ultimately, I partnered with my partner. He has no development background. He is 100% entirely comes from institutional investing. And so, he spent the majority of his career at BlackRock. He worked in New York. He worked in London. And he's exceptional.
How did you find him?
We met at a conference, actually. We met at Eric's Automatic in Atlanta.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. We ended up sitting across each other at dinner and he was like, "Hey, this is something that he had been kind of obviously he was at a real estate conference. So there was some intention there on his part. I was there more to see a couple of clients that were there. And I met a couple of new clients also there and just to hang out with Eric because he's wonderful. But yeah, we ended up sitting together at dinner and we started talking about like, hey, what are we doing next? What are you up to? Who are you? Whatever, and normal conversation. And through the course of that, we kind of realized that hey, there's something here that might be really great. Like so, we we talked for a long time about it. I mean, we spent like 8 months talking about the thesis in New York and the company and how the company runs and how my team currently works and how they would work together and what, you know, the economic component to it, right? Like the financial commitment for each of us was going to make, like how much time are we spending on this? Like all these things that um we took it very seriously from the beginning. So we got together, and then we also have an analyst that we work with who's wonderful, also has institutional experience, like ex Graystar, incredible at underwriting. So and so with my partner's name's Adrian. So with Adrian's guidance, like we have a great team on that side. Um, and so we've really gone down the list of all the things that we felt a lot of discomfort about, and we've mitigated as best as we can by surrounding ourselves with people who are exceptional. And that took many months and many years of conversation and vetting and references to sort of put the team together. So that's how we did it. I mean, I didn't just wake up one day and say I'm gonna start a fund. Like
Sometimes humility to know what you don't know is better than a perceived experience and a fake belief that you actually know it. I was talking to a private equity guy that was at a very large private equity firm, and he recently went out and started his own firm. And, I called him a year or 6 months later to check in. How's it going? He's like, I just never gave you enough credit. I never appreciated how hard it was to be an entrepreneur, to have your own firm, to do your own deals. Because I think a lot of people under the umbrella of this big platform, believe that maybe they're the reason why all this stuff is happening, but could be, but it's also that potentially you have this big umbrella, this big overlord, and he's an amazing guy, really smart. And he's like, I just didn't really totally anticipate like the intensity and the grind and the passion that comes from knowing that you have to fight for your, meal, your business, your people that work for you every day. It's totally different.
yeah, and I think it goes back to that like being adaptable sort of conversation, right? Where like you kind of define, and I think it's the biggest, I think for me, the biggest strengths from project management and how they um because at some point it wasn't just project management. At some point I'm running my own company, I'm selling my services. Um, and we I have this thing where we don't do any outbound. It's all inbound and word of mouth, which is a whole other business conversation. But I think the minute that we switch from, okay, you're no longer just a project manager working under this big umbrella. People are not picking up the phone because you have this name, this big name attached to your name. They're picking up the phone because it's you. Um, and I don't think I did this deliberately while I was working for the big guys, but I created enough of a reputation for myself with the people, with the trades, with the consultants, with, the network out of which I ended up hiring people to be on my team. I I built enough of that, my good name. Personally, it was me. It wasn't, yes, I had a big name attached to mine, but I valued those relationships very strongly and they valued me back. And when I started my development management company, I picked up the phone, I called a bunch of people. I said, "Hi, I'm out on my own." And I picked up a lot of work very quickly because of that. However, I think the resources that you have and the things that you need to figure out are it's completely different. And I think I'm thankful that I started in development and not like those big PE shops where you have a ton of resources that are just kind of built in. Generally in development, like you don't have that. Even if you work for a big name, for the most part, the teams are small and you don't have a ton of resources and you're kind of just having to figure a lot of it as you go. And so I'd had a lot of that experience under the comfort of a big name and under the comfort of you kind of have this understanding that like you have these resources, but none of them are defined. Like you can ask for software to be installed in your computer. You don't have to pay for it, right? But you still have to figure out like how am I going to use the software? How am I going to use it to organize my team? Like how much is it going to cost? Like do I have to justify it? Like you're having to do that in development for the most part in most places. So that actually helped to transition into when I was doing it for myself. I was like, okay. Um, but now going into the fund, and it's really the same, like it's a different expertise, but it's same system, if you will. Like there are things that we're, number one, it's defining the problem. Like, what do we need to do? And then number two is like, how do we do that? Right. And then like, who do you know? And who can you make sure answers the phone for you? So and thankfully I'd had time, a lot of time to build that goodwill and a lot of those connections. And social media has been huge too. I think a lot of these people I've met through either directly through social media or through people that I met through social media. So it was like someone. Um, so that's been a lot of it with the fund. And we've been very careful and very thoughtful because, again, we both have kind of like this institutional background of like, you can't screw this up and you got to be smart about it. And we've seen how the big guys do it. And so we know, but also we get the benefit of saying, well, these are the things that we would do differently, that we want to do better. And we're still running into hilarious stuff. Like today, we had a big call right before this one with Adrian, and we were talking about like investor communications for the fund. We've never done this before. And so it's more like, down to the very specific stuff of like, we really want to make sure we track emails well, right? We want to make sure that we know where all communications are. And so we're down to that level of specificity. But as we grow, I'm sure that'll be in a better, it'll be more automated and a lot less hands-on. But in the meantime, it's very hands-on because it's important to us, right? So
Well, use me for anything I could do to help you with any questions because I've made every single mistake in the book. We now use, Juniper Square for all that stuff. So,
we're using Labora, actually.
yep, you gotta have it. You gotta have it because investors will be like, "You never sent me this thing," and we have the proof that, yes, I sent it to you. I ask all the questions on all the guests on the podcast, the same closing question, and that is, what is your favorite hotel?
Oh, that's a tough one. Mm, my favorite hotel. I think it's a toss-up. I think I have like a tie. Um, I think one of the first is the Four Seasons at Jimbron Bay.
Just I mean, I've been there. It describe it. I mean, we'll put a picture up, I guess, because describe it. It's crazy.
So it's only villas. Um, and it's basically, I mean, it's a Four Seasons, so that already kind of sets the tone for what it is. And it's in Bali, and it has the most insane, like the landscaping. The whole campus is crazy. It has these like, I don't know how many restaurants it has, but I know we went to at least three inside the property without even leaving the compound. Um, and it's all very, like, the physical form is very much designed around service. And so everywhere you go, you have a butler, and it's sort of ridiculous, and it's pretty great if you're in that kind of vacation mood. Um, so that I'd say that that's one of my favorites. I unexpectedly ended up going there. Um, I didn't expect it to be like as nice as it was. I think when I went, I want to say it was like 2017. And for some reason, the rate was like I could actually afford it, which is also why it was
I
so
miss those
unexpected.
rates.
Yeah, me too. Me too. So I think that was part of it. I think there was some sort of like um extra glow from the fact that it was a rate I could afford, and then it ended up being this beautiful, insane. We had our own plunge pool. It was crazy. So that's the number one. And well, and then the tie, because I just really like the property and I really like just how great of a trip it is. But it's the St. Regis in Punta Mita. And that one I wouldn't say, it's obviously older hotel. It's not a Four Seasons. There is also a Four Seasons in Punta Mita that I haven't been to. But the St. Regis, it's very comfortable. Like, again, I think the way that they've set up the service around the property just makes it extremely, it's like extreme hospitality. I mean, that just might be their team, but also too, like if you get them to give you a ride to the edge of the compound because it's all in like a gated compound where there's also the Four Seasons and some private residences, and there might be another hotel in there. But if they give you a ride to the edge to the gate, and then you walk out, there's a lady that sits out there with a taco stand. And she runs out of tacos at like 10 in the morning. But, you know, it's definitely not the tourist experience. It's like it's like a convenience store, the gas station.
I love
And
it.
so it was so great. It's a great experience. And I think it really, and we love Mexico in general. It's just wonderful, like between the people and the culture. It's awesome. So that's my tie. It's the Four Seasons in Jim Brown Bay and like the St. Regis at Punta Mita.
Thanks for coming on the podcast. This was a lot of fun.
This was awesome. Thank you so much, Jake.
Hey everyone, it's Jake here. Thanks again for joining me on this conversation. Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Lastly, don't forget to follow me on Twitter at @JWurzak. I'll see you in the next episode.
Jake Wurzak is the founder and CEO of Dove Hill Capital Management. All opinions expressed by Jake and his guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of Dove Hill Capital Management. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not reflect or represent real estate, financial, or investment advice.